Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about the daily life of Roman prostitutes. It's a surprisingly well-documented topic, but it's also often misunderstood. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the bright lights and turn on a fan for a soft background hum. Let's start tonight's journey gently. You wake up, or more accurately, you become conscious again in a space that is just big enough to turn around without hitting your head on the wall. Well done, you live in a cellar. This is like the old Roman version of working from home. If your home was very small and your job involved working with people's bodies, these rooms were very common for many of Rome's working women. They were small, windowless rooms that were used as living space and for working. These rooms were found in brothels, lupanars, or stacked above taverns and bathhouse. Imagine a studio apartment designed by someone who doesn't like light, air, or privacy. Your mattress is straw-stuffed, you might have shared it with fleas, and it has a faint smell of wine, smoke, and disappointment. If you're lucky, there's a small oil lamp. If you're really lucky, it hasn't been stolen. Your few things, some cheap makeup, a comb, and maybe a bronze mirror if you've got some extra cash, are shoved into the corner like they too are tired of being here. There is no running water. There is no plumbing. There's a bucket you try not to think about. Bathing. We'll all do that together later at the nearest public bathhouse, where everyone shares the water and no one has to look at each other. But there's no time to relax, because your room is also your office, and you have to be available to work whenever someone knocks, barges in, or yells through the door. Yes, privacy is a modern idea. Here in Rome, walls are suggestions and doors are just for show. Most days, I start off by tidying up my room. Sweep away yesterday's dust, wine stains, and any sandals that visitors left behind last night. Then it's time to get ready. Face powder, rouge, and perfume in such strong scents that it could catch fire. You're not trying to smell good. You're trying to smell better than the person in the queue behind you. You practice your best sexy smile in the bronze mirror. It's not because it works, but because pretending helps. A customer once described you as charmingly awake, and you're still feeling that way. Here in the cellar, every day is the same. Cramped, rushed, and filled with just enough dignity to make it to lunchtime. After you get up in your old, small office, it's time to get ready for another day of impressing clients and dealing with what people think of you. But first, cleanliness, or what was considered clean in ancient Rome. There is no private bathroom. That luxury is for the rich, and even they just had pots with ambition. As a working girl in a city that has marble statues, but also open sewers, your best option is the nearest public fountain or bathhouse, depending on how you feel and how much you can handle. If you don't have much time, you'll probably just quickly rinse at the communal fountain. Splash some water on your face, rinse out your mouth with wine if you like, and hope the fountain hasn't been used to clean a chicken that morning. There's no soap, but maybe you've got a bit of natron, a salty cleaning powder that exfoliates your skin and your self-esteem. If you're not busy and have some spare cash, you could treat yourself to a visit to the public baths. The great Roman equalizer. Everyone's there. People like shopkeepers, soldiers, philosophers, and the guy who always talks about his hemorrhoids. You undress, put your things in a place you trust, and wade into cold water full of big ideas and someone else's toenail. You sweat in the steam room, use a strittle, a curved metal blade, to scrape yourself and enjoy feeling like the cleanest person in your street for about 5 minutes. After you get out of the bath, you dry off, put on more perfume, and try to remember if anyone has invented deodorant yet. They haven't. To finish the look, add a little chalk-based face powder, a touch of rouge for the cheeks and lips, and kohl around the eyes. Don't make your beauty stand out. Cover up the tiredness. Clients don't want to see the woman who's already dealt with 3 senators and a sailor before noon. They want mystery, charm, and someone who smells nice. Now that you're washed, or at least smelling nice, it's time to get dressed. Roman society had many complicated opinions about fashion, but there was one outfit that made things very clear. The female toga. Yes, toga. That flowing white garment we usually see on senators, emperors, and at university parties. But there's more to it. In ancient Rome, a woman wearing a toga wasn't making a political statement. She was making a professional one. It was a visual advertisement for the idea that I'm not a respectable housewife, and I am available for negotiation. Proper Roman women wore the stola, a long, layered dress that showed that they were controlled by their husbands and went to bed at 9. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were not allowed to wear the stole by law and had to wear a toga, which was often short, brightly colored, and very flashy. Think less like a Greek goddess, more like someone you can see easily from across the forum. The outfit was usually made up of cheap jewelry, bronze or glass beads, and maybe some loud earrings. The goal wasn't to make it look elegant. It was because it was difficult to see. When you're competing with 20 other women in a 100-meter race, you can't afford to be subtle. The people will probably wear simple sandals or maybe no shoes at all, depending on where they are and how much money they have. Comfort wasn't a priority. You're going to spend a lot of the day standing, walking, and occasionally running away from a bad client or someone who is too moral. There was a real problem. Roman prostitutes often curled and dyed their hair, sometimes wearing wigs, especially blonde ones imported from Gaul. In Rome, blonde hair was seen as exotic, a bit like imported luxury soap, but even more so. And don't forget the finishing touches. Makeup. Use pale face powder to make your face stand out against your red lips and cheeks. Thick kohl eyeliner will make your eyes stand out. Try to look less tired. When you were fully dressed, you looked obvious, and that was the point. In a city of 1 million people, your outfit was your business card. If it made you look bold, sexy, and rich, then congratulations. You were ready for another day of being judged by society while being funded by it. So, you got your clothes on, you put on some makeup, you've chosen a perfume, and hopefully you're not feeling too sick. Now it's time for the fun part. Trying to make money in a city where everyone wants sex, but pretends they're shocked when they find out it's for sale. In ancient Rome, marketing wasn't subtle. There were no pamphlets, no websites, and definitely no branding consultants. If you wanted clients, you had to be seen, be loud, or be painted on the wall. Ideally, all three. Let's start with the strategy for choosing a location. If you worked in a Lupin or brothel, your office was already built to be easy to see. Brothels were often found near baths, markets, or drinking places. Basically, anywhere people might already be sweaty, bored, or easily persuaded. Imagine how people would walk there in the past. Standing in the doorway, wearing your best outfit, you'd call out to people passing by with a mixture of flattery, negotiation, and time-sensitive offers. 2 denarii if you're quick. Hey, I know this might sound like I'm desperate, but the rent was due and the girl next door just lowered her price to 1. If you're self-employed, it was all about roaming visibility. You might go near temples because nothing says divine inspiration like temptation. Or you could hang around taverns, ready to flirt with a tipsy soldier who still had some money and was not very good at making decisions. But perhaps the most bizarre and weirdly effective form of Roman advertising. Well, graffiti. Yes, Pompeii has shown how good ancient street marketing was. The walls of the brothel were covered in reviews written by hand. They said things like, "Maritimus gave me the best time of my life," and "Felicia gave me my denarii very quickly." These are more than just acts of vandalism. They were like Yelp in the old days. No filters, no rules, and everyone could see what they were doing. Some women even paid someone to write their name and what they do for a living somewhere you can see it, usually near pub entrances or on columns. Others let their clients write the reviews, and these reviews were very mixed, ranging from very positive to very negative. This made one thing clear. To survive, a prostitute had to market herself as well as she could. If people didn't know your name, your rates, and how enthusiastic you were, someone else was getting the business. In ancient Rome, like today, success wasn't always about talent. Sometimes it was just better for the company's reputation. So, you've advertised yourself. You've got the outfit, the eyeliner, and just enough confidence to fake a good mood. Now, it's time to talk about how much it will cost. The bit where ancient Rome pretends to be a free market, but secretly judges you. Anyway, let's be clear. There was no union. Rates were based on supply and demand, and on how far you could go in getting something for nothing. For people working on the street or in low-end pubs, prices could be as low as 1 or 2 asses, a small bronze coin that wouldn't even buy you a glass of wine. That's right. Some clients were paying less than the cost of a decent lunch. If that sounds depressing, remember that some women were happy to accept food, sandals, or even promises as payment. Yes, in a city with a lot of money, IUS was still used. On the other hand, high-end prostitutes, often called meretresses, were more like luxury brands. These women could charge in denarii silver coins, sometimes multiple ones per client, especially if they had skills outside of the bedroom. They could offer conversation, music, poetry, basic literacy, or anything else that would make a client think they were hiring more than just a company. They were hiring taste. Some prostitutes even had their own special areas, not just places, but special areas that they owned. Maybe you specialized in working with sailors, or performing erotic dances, or reciting poetry during the act. Don't laugh. OID probably inspired someone. If your brand is unique, it's less likely to be replaced. You might get a discount if you come back to us again. It all depended on whether they paid on time, or if they smelled like fermented cabbage. And if you worked for a pimp or brothel owner, they would take a large percentage of your earnings. Some women were slaves. This meant they didn't get paid. They only got food, a place to live, and the vague promise that one day they might buy their freedom if they won the Roman lottery. Welcome to the Lupanar, the Roman brothel. It's not luxurious, but it has walls, which makes it more dignified than working behind tavern. It's a place of business. In reality, it's a maze of bad decisions. The word lupanar comes from luper, which means she-wolf, and the Romans used this as slang for prostitute. That's right. Your job title was also your animal comparison. It's not exactly empowering, but at least it's consistent. Most of these buildings were 2-story buildings built between bars and bathhouse, which were perfect for catching the attention of drunk senators and sailors. Inside, there's a narrow hallway with small rooms. Each room has a stone bed, a thin mattress, and just enough space to think about your life. There are no doors, just curtains to make it feel open. Privacy was something that rich ladies had. You have damp linen and the sound of someone snoring through your wall. You're not alone, of course. A proper lupanar had several working women and one delightful parasite, known as the Leno pimp or Lena madam. Their job was to take a cut of your earnings, promise repairs that never happened, and occasionally yell things like, "Work faster." He's important. The clients were a mix of nervous teenagers, sweaty soldiers, and balding senators. They said they were just visiting for a philosophical discussion. Some were in and out in the blink of an eye. Others tried to discuss their poetry, but this was not very good. When you're not busy, you'd sit near the entrance, putting on a flirty face while calling out to people passing by. Marketing was mostly about how much stuff we sold. 2 coins, special today. I'll pretend to listen. And yes, the walls were covered in graffiti, and there were old Yelp reviews written into the plaster. Felix was here twice, and ties is a good time. Sometimes someone got creative and drew pictures. The sizes were rarely correct, but he was always confident. Working in a lupanar wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. A roof over your head, a bed if you squint, and if nothing else, you'd always be able to watch some of the world's weirder sights. Not all Roman prostitutes worked in brothels. Some preferred or were assigned to the equally glamorous world of taverns. If the brothel was like a messy office, the tavern was more like working in an open-air startup with more vomit and fewer stock options. Taverns, Colponii or Popanii, were where Rome's best drinkers, traders, soldiers who were off-duty, and men with gambling debts met to drink, shout, and pretend they understood Virgil. For prostitutes working here, the motto was simple: serve the wine, sell the charm, and avoid the gropes. A normal shift was to pour watered-down wine into dirty cups because people wouldn't notice the difference. Anyway, with your other hand, you flirted just enough to keep the money flowing, but not so much that a fight broke out, unless that fight was entertaining, in which case carry on. Taverns were food establishments, unlike brothels. This meant you got to enjoy the smells and tastes of boiled cabbage, fish sauce, and body odor. It smelt of success, and it also meant you could persuade a client to spend more. For 2 more coins, I'll pretend you don't know about Garum. Some women worked in the back rooms or upstairs, making the tavern a part-time brothel with table service. Others were more relaxed, offering to sit with them and making comments like, "Your toga looks clean." This was seen as a big compliment in Rome. Payment was often made straight away. People didn't have credit. If a client tried to delay, you could yell, threaten them, or grab the bouncer, who was usually a retired gladiator with one eye and a short temper. The good thing about taverns was that they attracted more customers, and sometimes the tips were better. The problem was that you were a waitress, therapist, and hostage negotiator all at once, and no one tipped you for the emotional labor. And of course, there was the constant noise of the soundtrack, people shouting, dice clacking, and players trying to impress women. There were also the occasional arguments about who invented democracy. Working in a pub was always different, tiring, and smelly, but it paid the bills. If customers didn't throw up on your sandals, there was always the street. In Rome, working as a prostitute on your own meant being both an independent contractor and hoping the police wouldn't catch you. The Roman streets were full of life and sewage. Prostitutes who worked outdoors were known as prostitutes, and they would walk around in the alleys, bathhouse entrances, marketplaces, and sometimes even temple steps. After all, what better place to offer a discount than outside a shrine to Venus? It was fine to drive during the day, but it was risky. You had to deal with amazed onlookers, curious judges, and angry wives who thought your existence was ruining their husband's self-control. Spoiler, it wasn't. You dressed brightly to stand out. Think short tunics, flashy jewelry, and maybe a wig made from imported German hair. It was less subtle and more obvious from across the Circus Maximus. The plan was to catch a client's eye before his wife caught him. Going up to a possible customer meant being careful not to do anything wrong, and making sure you got the timing right so you didn't seem like someone's runaway slave. You'd smile, compliment his sandals, and casually mention your rate before the local vigilantes decided your entrepreneurialism was public disorder. Some clients were polite, others were very cheap, and a few were very confused and just wanted directions to the bathhouse. You quickly learned to tell them apart. You could tell by how much eye contact they made and how many coins they jingled. There was a lot of competition. You weren't just competing with other well-known companies. You were up against free lovers, drunken party girls, and retired gladiators with a side hustle. Everyone was trying to make a denarius. There were no benefits, no security, just your charm, your smarts, and the ability to walk very fast in sandals. Some carried small knives, while others relied on the bouncers from the nearby taverns for protection. Others just hoped that the customers tonight weren't too deep in thought. Even though it was chaotic, there were some good things about the street. You can choose when you want to work, how much you want to earn, and you don't have to worry about a boss who is always watching you. Sure, there were sometimes drunk goats or people who wanted to argue about philosophy, but at least you were your own boss. In a city where bosses were rarely good people. If you thought the life of a Roman prostitute was already tough, then you should meet your least favorite client, the Roman tax collector. Yes, the Roman Empire. These clever engineers who were also experts in the Mediterranean, and the people who wore togas also came up with a special tax for prostitutes. It was called the vectigal excapturus, and it made sure that even your most awkward encounters contributed to Rome's public infrastructure. Well done. Your nightly services just paid for another aqueduct. The tax was more than just a way of secretly taking money from people. This was a system that was officially approved by the state and run by professional collectors called publicani. These men were both boring and scary. They kept detailed records, demanded payment in cash, and probably judged your perfume choices while scribbling on their wax tablets. To legally work as a prostitute, prostitutes had to register with the idols, the Roman equivalent of a city inspector who liked paperwork and thought they were better than others. When you signed up, you were put on an official list of sex workers. Imagine joining a trade union, but with no perks, and instead of a card, you get a branding. Some sex workers, especially those who were enslaved, had marks like Looper or their owner's name tattooed on them. If you're wondering how that made clients feel, don't worry. The branding wasn't for them. It was to make sure you couldn't pretend to be respectable later, and also to do with the tax rate. It changed depending on where you were, what class you were, and whether your clients were sad senators or cheap gladiators. But always stung. You pay for each service or for each week of service, depending on the area. And there was no deduction for emotional labor, uncomfortable silences, or feelings of despair. If you don't pay, you might get fined, arrested, or banned from working. Although the tax was sometimes not enforced, especially if you were paying less than the official rate or if you had the right connections, it still made things worse for a profession that was already seen in a negative way. Rome was essentially saying, we don't approve of the way you live. Also, give us 10%. But there's a bright side. You can proudly say that your work is helping to pay for another temple. This temple is probably dedicated to a goddess who still wouldn't listen to your prayers. In Rome, if you were a prostitute, the law said you were allowed to be there, and people said you could be judged as much as they liked. Yes, prostitution was tolerated by the law, taxed, regulated, and even registered. But that didn't stop every senator, priest, and philosopher from telling you how much they disapproved of you, often while they were fastening their tunic. Now, the moral police are getting involved. It wasn't an official group with batons, but a huge network of people like senators, priests, matrons, and writers. They all thought it was their job to make you feel ashamed while enjoying the benefits you provided, but behind closed doors. The Roman Senate was the most hypocritical group of all. It was made up of old elites who believed in preserving Roman virtue. They defined virtue as anything that they weren't caught doing. Many of them publicly complained about the decline of morality while secretly paying for sex at every brothel from the Forum to the suburbs. Then you had the aediles, Rome's real public officials who made sure people were clean, orderly, and decent. Their job was to control brothels, check the establishments, and sometimes fine women for being too obvious about their job, which again was required by law to be obvious. You couldn't make it less obvious if you tried. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca really enjoyed it. They made fun of prostitutes in poetry, comparing them to greedy merchants, loud women, and even worse, women who read books. But these same writers also gave very detailed descriptions of life in a brothel, as if they'd done a lot of research. Even Roman matrons, the respectable wives of the elite, got involved in the judgment. They wouldn't speak to you, of course, but they'd look at you in a way that would make you feel dirty. Some people even asked for laws that would ban prostitutes from wearing jewelry or going to public baths. This is interesting because many of their husbands treated going to bathhouses like a part-time job. Working as a Roman prostitute was dangerous. There were many risks, including catching diseases, getting hurt, and catching whatever it was that the sailor from Brundium had left behind. Welcome to the health and wellness chapter. Here, the only medicine is hope that you survive. First, let's talk about venereal disease. Ancient Rome didn't have germ theory, but they did know that some men left you with more than money and a bad poem. There are old Roman texts that describe symptoms ranging from constant itching to things falling off that shouldn't. The medical advice was usually a mixture of vinegar washes, herbal ointments, and desperate prayers to Venus. People were also very worried about getting pregnant. There was no birth control pill, but there were options if you were brave and had enough money. Prostitutes used natural methods to avoid getting pregnant. They used things like sulfur, an extinct plant that was famous for this. They also used animal intestines as crude condoms and wool tampons soaked in herbal mixtures. It's somewhere between a maybe and a miracle. If she got pregnant, things got complicated. Some women carried their babies to term and raised them, often in the brothel. Others gave their babies to foundling homes, or even worse, left them on the streets. Infanticide wasn't legal, but it was seen as something that everyone had to accept. When they were feeling unwell, had sore muscles, cuts, or were stressed and angry, the best thing to help them was wine, opium, or a slap from your leaner to stop whining. If that doesn't work, you could try visiting a temple of Asclepius and sleeping on the floor, hoping for a healing dream. In ancient times, people thought that wellness was more about magic and mysticism than just going to the spa. Infections were common. Hygiene was ambitious. There were no gloves, no antiseptics, and absolutely no one washed their hands before putting their fingers in places where they shouldn't be. And we can't forget how it makes us feel. Depression, trauma, and anxiety are all part of the job. Rome didn't have therapists. You had other prostitutes, wine, and sometimes a stray cat who listened to you. In a city where people blamed divine intervention for everything from floods to flatulence, prostitutes weren't just avoiding moral judgment. They were trying to stay on the God's good side, or at least bribe them for good health, luck, and a clientele that didn't require much maintenance. In ancient Rome, religion was a full-time job. The gods were always watching, judging, and sometimes cursing. But some of the gods in the divine pantheon were more understanding of your profession. First, there was Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and poor decision-making. Many prostitutes put small altars in their rooms to her. People offered flowers, perfume, or money in the hope of attracting wealth, charm, or at the very least, clients who didn't smell of boiled goat. Then came Fortuna, the goddess of luck. Your daily income was random, ranging from a gold bracelet to 3 moldy grapes and a promise. So Fortuna was important. You might wear a charm with her face on it, or say a quick prayer before a customer with too many rings and sandals that looked too clean walked in. But religion wasn't just about fun and games. Belief could be dark. It could include superstition, omens, and magical countermeasures. When you're not sure what's going on, it's easy to blame the spirits. In some cultures, people would burn incense to protect themselves from the evil eye. They would also tie red cords around their ankle as a talisman, or even hire a professional, which to curse their rival prostitute's hairline. Don't laugh. Cursed tablets called depictions have been found all over Roman brothel districts. Many people read these reviews like they're ancient history. I hope her tongue dies. I hope her clients disappear. I hope she trips and lands in donkey poo. If you were a slave, you might also pray to Mercury, the god of business and trade. Let's be honest, your life was like one long receipt. If you were lucky enough to save money, you could buy a candle for Libertus, the goddess of freedom. All this spiritual effort wasn't just tradition. It was a fight for survival, but with style. When Rome gave you problems, illness, and rude politicians, the gods were your human resources department. Mostly useless, occasionally helpful, and always accepting offerings. Love in the Roman world of prostitution was complicated. At best, it was a nice but not very realistic dream. At worst, it meant losing money. Clients fell in love all the time, or claimed they did, usually after 3 cups of wine and a long chat about their mother. Some were sincere, some were drunk, and some were trying to get a discount. "But baby, I'm different," they'd say, holding your hand tightly like a sad poet. You would nod politely, thinking about how much they still owed you. Some working women felt the same, or at least pretended to. Emotional labor was part of the job. Smile, listen, and pretend his toga doesn't smell like despair. You might even develop a real connection with a few clients. This could be attachment, affection, or just being totally exhausted together. But love was often a dangerous distraction, especially because Rome law said that if you were infamous, which meant you had done something wrong, you were not allowed to marry a citizen, even if you wanted to. But that didn't stop people from trying. There are stories of prostitutes who fell in love with their regulars. They were promised freedom, marriage, and a house with a garden, but they ended up being left alone the moment another woman with better eyeliner walked by. Some of the clients loved their companion so much that they gave them gifts, poems, and sometimes even freed them legally. These stories exist, but they were rare. Prostitutes were more likely to form close relationships with each other. You worked together, faced the same insults, and shared the same lice. Some of these friendships turned into sisterhoods. Others became secret romantic partners, living hidden from the Roman patriarchy, which believed women couldn't fall in love with anyone except a man with a sword collection. And of course, there were lies you told yourself that one day you'd quit, that your best client would really take you away. If you could just save a little more money, you could open a perfume shop in Austria and never look back. Maybe it wasn't true, but in Rome, everyone had a fantasy. Yours just came with better lighting and lower expectations. In the world of Roman prostitution, beauty was worth a lot of money and youth was the most important thing. So, what happened when the blush wore off, the client stopped lingering, and your joint started making more noise than your earrings? Easy. You lost your eligibility, but you're still here. Some women who had saved money or who were lucky enough to have a client with both money and the means to pay were able to buy their freedom if they were enslaved and start over. The most fortunate people opened restaurants or bathhouses and rented out rooms to the next generation of hopeful people. Others became madams, which were basically the brothel's top bosses. There's less action and more shouting. As a leaner, you didn't need to be young or pretty. You had to be smart, scary, and good at making threats about sandals and money that was owed. You were in charge of the schedules, the books, and making sure the curtains weren't too scary. Clients were scared of you. The people you worked with pretended to show you respect. The Edels let out a sigh when they saw you coming. Other retired sex workers were fortune tellers. After all, when you've heard every confession and watched every mistake, it's easy to predict doom. Some of them started working as therapists, but not as proper therapists. Instead, they were like wise women or herbalists, giving advice that was a bit sarcastic and sometimes wrong. But many people just carried on working because Rome didn't give pensions to women who'd spent 20 years wearing a toga. Older prostitutes still had clients. They just changed their marketing strategy. It's not a shy flower. It's more mature, calm, and it can handle poetry. How someone looked was important, but so was their reputation. She is known for being a great conversationalist, being kind, or being very intelligent. People will still want to know what their star sign is even after she is no longer popular. And for those with no savings, no regular customers, and no good luck. There weren't many options. You begged, you cleaned temples, you worked in until your hands turned into shriveled olives. Rome didn't care how you got old. It just wanted you to do so quietly. But here's the truth. They didn't carve into marble. For many, just surviving was a big achievement. If you made it to old age without losing your marbles and still had at least one working sandal, you were already a legend. When people think of ancient Rome, they imagine marble statues, grand speeches, and emperors with complicated family trees. But they rarely think about the woman who is leaning in a brothel doorway, adjusting her wig and thinking about how many coins she needs to have in the next week to avoid starving. Roman prostitutes didn't just work in secret. History has kept them out of the story so that school children can learn about aqueducts without asking awkward questions. But you could find them everywhere, in graffiti, legal records, satire, poems, love letters, curse tablets, and receipts. Yes, I'm talking about real receipts. They were a normal part of daily Roman life, even though society treated them like something that was morally wrong. History often wrongly assumes that these women were powerless victims or bad people. The truth is, many of them were smart, flexible, and actually better at business than half the Senate. They knew how to read people, negotiate, avoid danger, and make a living in a city that cheered gladiators and stoned anyone who wore the wrong shoes. And they weren't all the same. Some of them were enslaved, and some were free. Some were for the rich, while others were for anyone who had a little money and a bad mouth. Some people hated every second, while others found small ways to make life easier. Most people existed somewhere in between, just like everyone else in Rome, pretending they weren't tired. They were rarely the ones to write their own stories. Instead, they were remembered by poets looking for metaphors, by moralists clutching their pearls, or by archaeologists piecing together Pompeii's raciest wall scribbles. But here's what's remarkable. You can still see them in stone carvings, in sarcastic graffiti, in laws and loopholes, and in offhand mentions in love poems. These women were ignored by society, but not by reality. They worked hard, laughed, scammed, wept, and endured many hardships. There are no marble statues or gilded tombs, just faint writing on a wall that is falling apart. Maritima was here and was worth the money. So, the next time someone talks about how great Rome was, remember that behind every smart-looking philosopher was a working girl who was helping the economy and keeping people informed about what was going on. In the world of the Vikings, there was always war. This meant that people got hurt in many ways. They might get deep cuts from swords, axe wounds, broken bones, or burns from fire and frost. This could happen on the battlefield or back in a village. The healer, Leknir, was called to treat the wounded. These people were respected members of society. They used their knowledge of herbs and Norse beliefs. A Viking healer would always have trusted yarrow, a milfoil, in their collection. Yarrow is known for its ability to stop bleeding. It was used a lot in Northern Europe. Viking healers would crush the leaves and put them directly onto wounds, either on their own or mixed in a pus. Yarrow helped to stop blood from flowing and prevented infection by acting as a coagulant. People thought it had special powers and were connected to the god Odin. Preparing these remedies was a careful and traditional process. The healer might wash the wound with boiled water mixed with herbs that kill germs, apply a poultice made from crushed yarrow, and bind the area tightly with strips of linen or animal skin. Sometimes, people sang or prayed to the gods for protection or healing. Healing was not just physical, it was also spiritual. As well as being used to treat injuries sustained on the battlefield, yarrow was also used as a medicine. A tea made from its flowers and leaves could reduce fevers, ease stomach aches, or help with period pain. It was a plant that could be found growing in the Viking countries in fields near rivers, or in small gardens that were looked after by women. Healers in Viking society understood their environment very well. They knew which plants grew at which times of the year, how to harvest them properly, and how to preserve them so they could be used during the long, dark winters. People learned from their parents or teachers. These traditions mixed Germanic herbal law with the rich Norse mythology. In a world without modern hospitals or antibiotics, the skill of the healer and the power of plants like yarrow were essential to survival. They were also important for keeping warriors strong. While yarrow could treat bleeding and surface wounds, the Viking healer needed to treat infections in a more serious way. One of the most popular herbs was angelica. Angelica archangelica is a tall plant that smells nice. It has hollow stalks and a lot of greenish-white flowers that grow in clusters. It grew well in the cold climates of Scandinavia and was considered so valuable that it was cultivated in monastery gardens long after the Viking Age ended. In the old days, before science made more modern medicines, people used a plant called angelica in lots of different ways to treat all sorts of illnesses. Viking healers used the root, leaves, and seeds to prepare a variety of treatments. Most commonly, the root was dried and then steeped into decoctions to fight internal infections. It was known for its warming effect on the body and was used to improve blood flow, cleanse the blood, and reduce inflammation. Angelica was used to treat infected wounds because it was antiseptic. It was especially good for wounds that had been neglected or exposed to dirt and decay. A healer might grind the root and mix it with animal fat or beeswax to create a healing ointment, then apply it to infected wounds. When taken as a tea or tincture, angelica could help treat respiratory infections, fevers, and digestive issues. These were diseases that could be life-threatening in a time before antibiotics. But angelica's power was more than just being able to heal people. In Norse beliefs, certain plants were thought to have special powers. The name angelica comes from Latin and is a nod to the spiritual respect for the plant. In Europe, where Christianity was the main religion, it was said to have been revealed by an angel to cure the plague. Vikings believed in different gods and goddesses, but they also thought that some plants were gifts from the gods. It is likely that angelica, with its strong smell and dramatic look, was thought to bring protection and sacred power. Women who often worked as herbalists in their homes used angelica to treat women's health problems. People thought it could help women to have regular periods and make childbirth easier. Childbirth was a dangerous and important moment in Norse society. Because of its reputation as a purifier, angelica was also used in smoke rituals to cleanse homes and ward off disease during times of illness. In every Viking community, from remote farms to coastal trading towns, angelica was an important part of natural medicine. It was very effective and important to the healer's work of keeping people alive in a difficult and dangerous world. When spring arrived in the Viking world, it brought with it one of the most important cures for fever and tiredness: birch sap. The birch tree, which grows in lots of places in Scandinavia, was more than just a source of wood. It was a pharmacy where you could buy medicine. Vikings tapped the tree in early spring, collecting the clear, slightly sweet sap as it rose from the roots to nourish new leaves. This seasonal practice required skill and timing. Healers used birch sap as a tonic for people who had been weak from long winters, illness, or fevers that lasted for a long time. This was because the sap could only be harvested for a short period before the tree fully woke up. It was either fresh or fermented into a drink that gave you a little bit of a buzz. Birch sap is full of minerals, electrolytes, and natural sugars. It helps the body get back its energy if you have been sick or haven't eaten for a long time. In the past, before we had formal nutrition science, Viking healers knew that this natural gift could heal the body. Healers often used birch sap mixed with cool herbs like meadow or elderflower when someone had a fever. This helped make the patient feel cooler and gave their body what it needed. In more serious cases, the sap might be mixed with bitter herbs like wormwood to get rid of what was believed to be harmful. The logic was simple: cleanse, restore, and rebalance. The birch tree was used for more than just internal purposes. It was also used in external treatments. When you boil the bark, it produces a tar-like substance that has antiseptic properties. It was used to treat skin infections, minor burns, and bites. Birch leaves were also used in pick-uses, a type of steam bath, to draw out toxins from the body, often accompanied by prayer or ritual to align the physical with the spiritual. The birch tree was a symbol of new life and purity. It was often the first tree to grow after land was cleared or burned, and this made it important in both Germanic and Norse traditions. The belief that its sap could heal people is reflected in the way it is used to treat sick people and to help them recover after difficult times. In the healer's practice, birch sap was a seasonal treasure. It was a clear, life-giving liquid that marked the changing of the year and the persistence of health in a cold and often cruel land. In Viking herbal medicine, juniper was highly regarded for its ability to cleanse the body and spirit. Juniper bushes grew in the rocky soils of Scandinavia and were used by healers because of their prickly needles and aromatic berries. People used juniper to purify their bodies, the air, and even their spirits. They did this by burning, boiling, or brewing it. Juniper berries were often used to make people pee more and treat urinary tract infections. When you drink them as a tea or decoction, they help the kidneys work better. This helps the body get rid of excess water and harmful substances. This made them especially useful during illnesses that involved swelling, bloating, or fevers that lasted for a long time. The berries also had mild antiseptic properties, which meant they could treat infections from within. This was very important in an age before antibiotics. Juniper smoke was very important for breathing problems. Healers would burn dry juniper branches and let the smoke fill a room or a tent, because they believed it could drive out disease. This wasn't just a symbol. The special chemicals in juniper smoke helped to clean the air. This was a way to cleanse Viking homes and ships during outbreaks of sickness or after death. The practice was both practical and spiritual, getting rid of what could be seen and what couldn't. In steam baths and sweat lodges, a traditional practice in many Northern European cultures, juniper branches were sometimes placed on the hot stones or added to the water. As the steam rose, it carried the strong, refreshing smell of the plant, opening the lungs and making the body sweat. This was thought to cleanse the body of toxins and the soul of imbalance, reconnecting a person with the rhythms of nature and health. Juniper was also important in rituals. People might hang branches over doorways to protect against evil or carry them in small bundles while traveling for protection. Its strong, earthy smell was a reminder that even though things might seem difficult, we can always get through them. It was also a reminder that healing was about more than just physical problems. It was also about dealing with the things we can't see. For Viking healers, juniper was more than just a medicine. It was a symbol of new life and protection. It was like a guardian plant that stood between us and the wild forces of the world. Its sharp needles and strong berries helped them stay healthy, one breath of smoke or sip of tea at a time. Viking healers knew many herbs. They thought that meadow phlox Maria, was very good at reducing pain and swelling. This sweet-smelling plant with white flowers, which grows in damp meadows and along riverbanks, was an important part of traditional Germanic and Norse medicine. Viking healers didn't have modern medical terms, but they knew that some plants could reduce fevers, make people feel better, and help the body heal more gently. People often used meadow to treat headaches, joint pain, and digestive problems. The flowers and leaves were dried and used to make teas. These teas were given to patients with fevers or aches and pains. People often complained about this in a harsh climate where physical work and being outside was just part of everyday life. The herb was used to help people feel better when they were sick or getting better. The Vikings didn't know about this, but meadow contains chemicals similar to aspirin. This natural pain-relieving ability explains why it was so effective and was used so often. Healers didn't know the chemistry, but they knew what the results were. It reduces fever, swelling, and discomfort. These benefits were especially important during the winter months, when lots of people caught colds, had joint pain, and respiratory infections. For digestive issues, meadow was thought to be a mild treatment for feeling sick, heartburn, and stomach cramps. It is good for calming the stomach, and sometimes it is mixed with other herbs like chamomile or mint to make a bigger treatment. The plant's sweet scent also made it a comforting addition to healing rituals, which often blended the senses with medicine. Meadow's role wasn't just about making people better physically. Its delicate, almost ethereal presence tied it to the natural cycles of growth and decay, life and death. As with many Viking remedies, its use may have included symbolic gestures, such as laying its flowers near the sick or including it in burial rites to make the journey to the afterlife easier. Some sagas and later folk traditions say that sweet-smelling herbs were gifts from the gods or spirits of the land. In a culture that valued strength but also recognized the importance of healing, meadow was a supportive but unassuming ally. It helped warriors rest, allowed children to recover, and gave elderly people comfort in their final years. For the healer, it was one of the gentlest and most reliable tools in their care. Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, was very important in the Viking healer's work. It is used as a medicine and as something that helps you connect with your spiritual side. Mugwort is a plant that is well known in Northern Europe for its strong smell and silver-colored leaves. In Germanic tradition, it was considered one of the most sacred plants. In Viking societies, where healing was about more than just the body, mugwort was a way to connect the body, the mind, and the unseen world. Mugwort was used in medicine to treat lots of different illnesses. It helped with stomach problems, periods, and tiredness. The tea made from its leaves was used to ease stomach cramps, stimulate appetite, and support the liver. Viking women used mugwort to help them have their periods and give birth. In a world without midwives or modern obstetrics, the healer's knowledge of such herbs was vital for survival during pregnancy and delivery. Mugwort also had powerful nervine properties, meaning it calmed the nervous system. For warriors who felt restless or had nightmares, drinking mugwort tea or smoking it was believed to help them feel calm again and protect their minds. Sleep, which was often disturbed after battle or illness, could be brought back by burning dried mugwort near the bed or under the pillow. This wasn't just superstition. Many aromatic herbs can make you feel a bit sleepy. But beyond its medicinal uses, mugwort was strongly linked to ritual and magic. Viking healers and wise women often used mugwort in ceremonies to bring on dreams, protection, or visions. They called this valur or sitkinur. It was sometimes burned during cider making, which was a kind of magic and prophecy practiced by the Norse. People believed that the smoke went up to heaven to reach the gods or to keep bad spirits away. Healers might also use mugwort during solstice ceremonies, seasonal changes, or in times of emotional distress. A bundle of mugwort could be hung over the door to protect against bad things, carried in a pouch when traveling, or placed on the body when people were trying to heal. Its strong smell and powerful energy made it a plant for times when the body or soul was changing. To the Viking healer, Mugwort was more than just a plant. It was an old place where people went to get better. It was at the crossroads of medicine and magic. It helped people get better not just physically, but also spiritually. Garlic, Allium sativum, was one of the most practical and powerful remedies used by Viking healers. Garlic was not originally from Scandinavia, but it had been traded across Europe for a long time. It may have reached the Viking world through early contact with the British Isles, Frankish territories, and Eastern markets. Its strong smell and powerful healing powers made it a key part of early Norse medicine, especially for treating infections, parasites, and protecting against disease. Even if scientists did not yet understand how it worked, everyone knew that garlic could kill bacteria and fungi. Viking healers used crushed garlic and poultices to clean wounds and stop them from getting worse. This is particularly important for injuries sustained during battle or travel. When you put it directly onto cuts, garlic can kill harmful microbes and reduce inflammation. This treatment was painful, but it was very effective in stopping more serious infections. At that time, even small wounds could be deadly. People often ate garlic raw, mashed it into a paste, or brewed it into strong drinks. People thought that it would make the immune system stronger, clean the blood, and warm the body when you were sick. In the harsh northern winters, when colds, fevers, and coughs were common, garlic was used as a medicine. It was sometimes mixed with honey, which is another substance that can kill microbes. This made the strong flavor more palatable and increased its healing effect. People also use garlic to treat parasites, especially intestinal worms. These were common because people did not have good sanitation and often came into contact with livestock. A mixture of garlic and vinegar was given to them in small amounts to get rid of what was inside them. It smelt strong and was used to cleanse and symbolize vitality in Norse healing traditions. People also believed that garlic was good for protecting against evil spirits and bad influences. Healers or people in the home might hang braided garlic near doorways or in bedrooms, not just to protect against disease, but to protect against other dangers, especially during times of illness, war, or childbirth. It was used as a medicine and a way to protect themselves spiritually. Garlic was not only a cure, but a way to protect yourself every day, before raids or journeys. Some people are thought to have drunk it to prepare, seeing its strength and fire as a protection within the body. This made garlic a symbol of strength and health. It was used to fight infection, give energy to people who were weak, and protect the body in a dangerous world that was always changing. In the Viking Age, the stinging nettle, Erica cinerea, was more than just a nuisance. It was a plant that had the power to do great things. Nettle was one of the most useful and respected herbs in Norse healing traditions, despite its painful sting. It grew in meadows, at the edges of forests, and near people's houses, so healers and ordinary people could easily find it. It had lots of medicinal benefits and could tolerate harsh conditions, which the Vikings valued because they thought it showed strength and endurance. Nettle was used mostly to treat problems related to blood and energy. Viking healers made nettle teas or broths to treat tiredness, iron deficiency, and weakness. Nettle is full of iron, calcium, and vitamin C, which made it a popular natural remedy, especially during long winters when fresh food was rare and people often got sick. If warriors were recovering from a battle or children were recovering from a fever, they would often be given nettle to help them get stronger again. The leaves were dried or cooked to reduce their sting and then used to make infusions. People thought that these drinks could clean the blood, improve blood flow, and help the body get rid of harmful substances. Nettle also made you pee more, which is good for people who have problems with fluid retention and joint pain, which a lot of people do if they're working or old. Nettle was sometimes used in surprising ways in external treatments. One treatment was to hit sore limbs with fresh nettle stalks. This was to improve blood flow and ease arthritis or muscle stiffness. It was believed to make cold or stiff parts of the body feel warm and move again, even if it was painful. This method is a bit unusual these days, but it comes from generations of people observing and believing in the plant's refreshing properties. Nettle also had other practical uses. People used its fibers to make things like rope, fishing nets, and cloth, especially when other materials like flax or wool were rare. This dual utility, nourishing the body and supporting daily life, made nettle an important part of Viking culture. In symbolism, nettle was a plant that showed resilience. It grew well in soil that had been dug up and was still alive and kicking, even though it was cut back a lot. In Norse society, where survival required both strength and adaptability, nettle represented those values. For the healer, it was a reminder that even the most painful plants could bring healing, and that power often came from what first seemed harmful. Viking herbal medicine was never written down in formal texts during the Viking Age. Instead, it was passed down through the generations by word of mouth, in chants taught by mothers to their daughters, in gestures shared among wise women, and the quiet work of healers who blended tradition, observation, and belief. These practices were based on Norse beliefs about the natural world. In the Viking world, treating illness was about more than just curing the body. It was also about restoring balance to the person, their household, and the invisible threads that connected them to the gods. In Viking society, healers used whatever the land provided. They knew which herbs to gather in spring, which roots to dry in autumn, and how to preserve medicinal plants through the long winter months. Yarrow, angelica, birch, juniper, meadow, mugwort, garlic, and nettle. Each person had a specific role, but all were part of a larger system of understanding the body in harmony with nature. The treatments were physical, but they also had a symbolic meaning. Illness can be seen as something that disrupts the course of fate, like a challenge from the gods, or a balance that's been upset between the visible and invisible worlds. Women played a central role in passing on this knowledge. In long houses and farmsteads, female healers were in charge of looking after families and communities. Some people had more specialized roles, like the velour seers, who healed people and told them what the future held, and were often called upon during times of crisis. Their work often included sacred herbs, spiritual rituals, and appeals to divine forces like Frigg, air, or Freya. Healing was not just a duty. It was a way of connecting people to the world of myths. When Christianity spread and Norse paganism declined, much of this traditional storytelling disappeared or was taken up by new religions. Some monasteries kept and used herbs and techniques, while others lost them or got mixed up with superstition and fear. But some of the old Viking herbal medicine is still used today in folk healing in Scandinavia, in modern herbalism, and in people being interested again in the knowledge of plants that their ancestors had. Viking healers used herbs, but they also believed in a special way of seeing the world. They thought that nature was powerful, that healing was both physical and spiritual, and that wisdom could be found in nature. John of Arver was born the winter of 1412 in a small village called Damy in northeastern France, near the border of Burgundy. At the time, France was at war with itself. The 100 Years' War between England and France had already lasted for decades, and northern France was caught in the middle. Joan was born into this period of change. She is the daughter of Jack of d'Arc and Isabel Rome, who were devout peasants and raised their children in the Roman Catholic faith. Her family didn't have much money. They had a small piece of land, a few animals, and they grew some of the food they needed to survive. Joan was not taught to read or write like most girls. But she was known for her hard work and deep religious devotion from an early age. She spent a lot of her childhood helping out at home, looking after sheep, and going to church. She was a simple person who was very religious. The voices she would later claim to hear would come to someone who already spent hours in prayer and thinking deeply. The area around the city was a place where there were a lot of arguments. Even though it was technically loyal to the French king, it was next to Burgundian territory, which was allied with the English. There was always the risk of violence. The region was sometimes attacked by Anglo-Burgundian forces. They destroyed crops and burned homes. Joan would have grown up hearing stories of brave people and those who did not win, of good people and bad people, of leaders and those who betrayed them. When she was young, she experienced a lot of change, fear, and a longing for peace. Despite the fear that hung over France, Joan had a good childhood. She was popular in the village, and her neighbors said she was kind, religious, and unusually serious for her age. She often prayed at a nearby chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, where she would later claim that her divine mission began. These years set the spiritual and emotional foundations for what was to come. Her faith, loyalty to the king, and sense of purpose were not formed in the royal court, but in the fields and chapels of her village. No one could have imagined that this peasant girl, who couldn't read or write, was unknown and barely a teenager, would one day stand before kings, lead armies, and challenge the might of empires. Joan of Arc's life changed forever when he was 13. She later said that in the summer of 1425, when she was alone in her father's garden, she had a vision and heard a voice that seemed to come from another world. At first, she was scared. The voice, which was surrounded by a bright light, was accompanied by the appearance of figures she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, three powerful saints in Catholic tradition. As time went on, these visions got stronger and clearer. The message was clear but amazing. God chose her to help save France. Her special job was to get the English out of French territory and make sure Charles the Dauphin was crowned as the rightful king of France. It was a huge revelation for a young peasant girl who had no experience of the army, no formal education, and no status in society. Joan didn't tell anyone at first. She kept the visions to herself, as she was afraid that people would not believe her or get angry. But the voices wouldn't stop telling her to do something. Over the next few years, she became more and more sure that her mission was real. She started praying and fasting even more, and believed that being pure and obedient was important for doing God's will. By 1428, the political and military situation in France had worsened. The English had captured much of northern France, and the city of Orleans, a key stronghold, was under siege. The Dauphins were not crowned, so it was not clear if he was the rightful king. Joan, now 16, felt it was time to do something. She went to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and asked to see the local commander, Robert de Baudrier. She said she had a message for the king. At first, Baudrier and his men thought she was joking. The teenage girl who said she was guided by God was not taken seriously. But Joan kept going. She came back repeatedly, speaking with a strong belief that made some people uneasy and impressed others. Eventually, after hearing reports of her reputation for being religious and knowing that she had predicted a military setback in Orleans before the news reached the town, Baudrier gave in. He agreed to send her, wearing men's clothes and with a gunman to protect her, to meet the DOA. Joan's journey from simple country life to a role in the military had begun, guided by strong beliefs, trust in her destiny, and a sense of her purpose. In early 1429, Joan of Arc arrived in Chinon, where Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, held his court. The journey had been long and dangerous. She traveled more than 300 miles through enemy territory, dressed as a man to avoid being noticed and attacked. When she finally stood before the royal court, the other people there were unsure and interested. Charles was unsure of her motives and wary of trickery, so he decided to test her. First, he put on plain clothes and hid with the other servants. Joan had never seen him before, but she immediately noticed him and spoke to him directly. The witnesses were amazed. She reportedly told him information that only he and his closest advisors would have known, possibly about a private prayer or secret doubt. For many people in the court, it was the first sign that something strange was happening. But Charles was still careful. He ordered that Joan be examined by religious experts and church officials in Poitiers. For several weeks, she was questioned about her visions, her morality, right and wrong, and her doctrine teachings. She was a teenage girl being questioned by smart men, but she answered calmly and confidently. People thought it was very important that she was a virgin because of her special role. The examiners didn't find anything wrong with what she said and said she was very clever and had a good character, even though she hadn't had any formal education. The court's advisors decided that she could be sent to Orleans with the army. But first, Joan asked for something that would show her role, not just as a soldier, but as a messenger from God. She asked for a banner. The banner she received was white and had a picture of Christ on it, along with the words, Jesus Maria. It would become very important to her, and she took it with her to every battle, saying that she liked the banner more than the sword. She was also given a special suit of white armor and a sword that she said had been sent to her by God. She had found the sword behind the altar of a chapel in St. Catherine de Foro. Joan was ready to go to Orleans with her armor, banner, and a group of soldiers. She was just 17 years old, young, untrained, and completely convinced that God had sent her to save France. When she arrived in the city under attack, this would be the start of one of the most famous military campaigns in European history. By the spring of 1429, the city of Orleans had been under siege by the English for several months. If it had fallen, it would have allowed the German army to reach the center of France, and it is likely that this would have led to the collapse of the French resistance. Everyone was feeling down, there was hardly any food left, and it looked like the Dauphin's fight might lose. Then Joan of Arc arrived. She arrived in the city on April 29th, where she was greeted by happy crowds who thought she was a miracle sent by God. She was wearing white armor and riding a white horse, and quickly became a symbol of hope and divine favor. Her presence made the French soldiers and citizens feel more energized. Even though she hadn't had any official military training, Joan spoke in a confident and assertive way, encouraging immediate action against the English strongholds. At first, the French commanders did not want to take orders from a teenage peasant girl, but they soon started to like her strong character. Joan wanted to use a strong strategy, saying that her supporters had promised to help her win. Despite her youth, she rode into battle beside the soldiers, often placing herself in the most dangerous positions. Her bravery on the field made others want to fight with even more determination. For 7 days, the French attacked to try to break the siege. Joan used her sword and her flag to encourage the soldiers, telling them to have faith and to be brave. She was hurt during the attack on the fortress of Lido when she was shot in the shoulder by an arrow. She refused to give up and went back to the battlefield after having her wound treated. She kept encouraging the men to keep going. On May 8th, the English finally stopped attacking and left. It was a great win, one that changed how the war was going. For the first time in years, the French had beaten the English. Joan's role was very clear. Her leadership, bravery, and spiritual strength had turned the tide. The win at Orleans was more than just a military success. This was a very important moment in how the French people thought about their country. The young peasant girl from Dom Remy had done the first part of her special mission. Now she was working towards her second goal, which was to see the Dauphin crowned as king at Reims, where French kings were traditionally crowned. The road to legitimacy had begun. Now that the siege of Orleans had been lifted, Jeanne of Arc's mission changed. It was now about a more symbolic objective, which was the coronation of Charles the Dauphin. In her visions, this was more than just a political event. It was God's will. Charles needed to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site where French kings were anointed with sacred oil. But Reims was in an area controlled by the Burgundians, who were the English's allies. To reach it, Joan and the French army would have to march through dangerous lands. But Joan was determined. Her belief that God had cleared the path made her feel confident, and her strong belief began to have an effect on even the careful Charles. After winning several battles along the Lyre Valley, including those at Joux, Msola, and Bajoni, they were feeling very confident. The army got stronger as towns gave in and people's spirits rose. On July 14th, 1429, Joan and the royal court set out on what was later called the coronation journey. As we went along, cities and castles opened their gates easily. News of Joan's amazing success had spread. Many people thought that to resist her was to go against God's will. She was young, determined, and riding under her white banner, which made her seem invincible. On July 16th, the French forces reached Reims. The city's leaders, after thinking about it, gave up peacefully. The next day, Charles was crowned King Charles II of France inside the Cathedral of Reims. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner high. For her, it was the fulfillment of the prophecy she had received from her voices. The coronation was a moment of triumph, both for the new king and for Joan. She started out in a small village and ended up leading armies and putting crowns on monarchs' heads. The people saw her not just as a heroine, but as a chosen messenger of God. Her presence had made the war a spiritual cause as well as a political one. But success brought tension. Now that Charles has been crowned, some people at court are wondering if Joan still has much influence. Politics became the main focus again. Joan had done the task she was asked to do, but she wasn't done yet. Next, she wanted to go to Paris and take it back. But the support she used to get easily was starting to fade. After the coronation at Reims, Joan of Arc wanted to free Paris from English and Burgundian control. For Joan, taking back the French capital was not just something she felt she had to do. Her mission was to return France to its rightful king. But not everyone was as worried as she was. King Charles III, who had just been crowned and was careful not to make any political mistakes, hesitated. His advisors told him to try talking to the Burgundians to make a deal. But Joan was determined. She believed that waiting would only strengthen the enemy, and that God had already made a way for them to win. In the end, Charles agreed to an attack on Paris, but not fully committed to it. He provided only a few troops and delayed the campaign, making the effort weaker before it began. Joan arrived outside the city in early September 1429 and got ready for battle. Paris had strong walls and experienced English and Burgundian forces inside. On September 8th, she led an attack on the Porte Saunier, one of the city's main gates. As always, she carried her flag and fought at the front, encouraging the troops with prayers and determination. The fighting was fierce. The defenders shot arrows and stones at them. Joan was hit by a crossbow bolt in the thigh, but she didn't give up. She continued to lead the battle from behind, calling for another attack. But the attack stalled. As night approached and the number of casualties grew, Charles's commanders ordered a retreat, even though Joan wanted to keep fighting. The failed attack on Paris was a turning point. Joan was still well-liked by the ordinary soldiers and citizens, but at court, people started to have doubts about her. She had more and more of an impact on the royal family's decisions. Charles, now king, no longer needed her as much as he did in the past. Politics, fear of causing more conflict, and doubts about Joan's spiritual power began to overshadow her earlier successes. But Joan was not put off. She continued to lead small campaigns in the following months, capturing towns like Sierre, Lumiere, and Lacherite, often paying for the operations herself with money from supporters. But things were starting to change. Her idea of a total victory was different to the king's more careful plan. Despite her injuries, the fact that fewer and fewer people were supporting her, and the fact that she was becoming more and more isolated in the political world, Joan was sure that her mission was not yet complete. She was determined to free France. But in the shadows, things were changing and trouble was coming. In the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc carried on her campaign. Although she had become more and more unpopular, her successes in battle had not made her politically powerful. King Charles V, who was now more focused on diplomacy than war, only offered a little support. Joan, working mostly on her own, looked after the town of Campania, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. She arrived in May 1430, hoping to defend the city and encourage the local people to join the fight. But she was at a disadvantage. The Burgundians, who were English allies, were getting closer with more soldiers. On May 23rd, Joan led a small group in an attack on the besieging army to try to break their lines. As the battle raged outside the city walls, the French forces were pushed back. Joan stayed behind to protect the retreating soldiers. In the chaos, the city gates closed too soon. Joan and a few friends were trapped outside. She was surrounded by Burgundian cavalry and fought until she was pulled from her horse and taken prisoner. It was very sad for Joan and for the French people. The girl who had once helped to end the siege of Orleans and crown a king was now a prisoner. The Burgundians kept Joan for months and treated her more like a political prize than a normal prisoner. She was eventually captured and sold to the English for a large amount of money, which confirmed that she was a threat to their cause. The English saw her not only as an enemy in the military, but also as a dangerous symbol of resistance and a legitimate ruler. While she was being held captive, Joan tried to escape more than once. One time, she jumped from a very tall tower and hurt herself really badly, but she survived. Even when she was tied up, she didn't give in. She insisted on being treated as a noble prisoner of war, not a criminal or heretic. But the English had other ideas. They did not plan to keep her there forever. They wanted to destroy her credibility, her reputation, and the power she had come to represent. Her trial was already being prepared. Joan's capture at Compiègne marked the start of her final, most terrifying chapter. She had risen from nothing to a position of great power, only to be betrayed, abandoned, and captured by her enemies. But her story was far from over. After spending months in Burgundy, Joan of Arc was moved to England and taken to Rouen, the English administrative capital in Normandy that had been occupied. In January 1431, she was put on trial in a church. This was not because she was a prisoner of war, but because she was a heretic. This meant that her captors could strip her of her honor and kill her according to church law. The English planned the trial, but a group of French religious leaders who supported the English, led by Bishop Pr0stitutes, did it. Bishop Pr0stitutes strongly opposed Joan and was loyal to the Burgundian cause. Its real aim was not to be fair, but to destroy Joan's reputation. The English tried to make her look bad to undermine the legitimacy of Charles V, whose coronation she had helped to happen. Joan was held in a non-religious prison, guarded by male soldiers, which was against church law. She was refused the right to speak to a lawyer, threatened with torture, and questioned many times, often for hours on end without any food or rest. Despite being a 19-year-old peasant girl facing some of the most educated men in France, She defended herself with remarkable intelligence and calmness. For several months, she was questioned about her visions, what she was wearing, her religion, and her role in the war. The judges were especially interested in her claim to have divine voices and her habit of wearing men's clothing, which the church considered both heretical and unnatural. But Joan kept on saying the same thing. She insisted that God was the one speaking through her, that she was just doing what God wanted, and that she had always been loyal to the church. At one point, when asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, she famously answered, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a strong answer. It wasn't rude or insulting, and it impressed even the people who were questioning her. But the result was never really in doubt. The truth was not as important as what was needed politically. Joan was eventually condemned for heresy, mainly because she refused to deny her visions and insisted on wearing men's clothes, which she had started doing in prison for protection. She was sentenced to death. The girl who had once inspired her whole nation would now be silenced, not by defeat in battle, but by a group of men who wanted to erase her from history. Or so they thought. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the market in Rouen. She was tied to a wooden stake and burned alive. She was only 19. As the flames rose around her, she reportedly called out the name of Jesus many times and asked for a cross to be held in front of her eyes. A soldier, impressed by her bravery, gave her a small wooden cross. Witnesses said she faced death calmly. Her death was meant to be the last one, a warning to stop her from speaking out. But it had the opposite effect. Instead of being erased, Joan became a martyr. Even English and Burgundian observers were upset by what they saw. Some people were crying, while others were saying that the church had done something very wrong. One of the English priests there is said to have shouted, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." Over the years, Joan's popularity only grew. Her unwavering faith, courage in battle, and dignified defense at trial made her a legend. Joan's trial was declared invalid in 1456, 25 years after her death. This was after a formal investigation that Pope Pius II had ordered. She was officially cleared of heresy, meaning her name was cleared. Over the next few hundred years, Joan of Arc became a symbol that united the French people. In times of national crisis, like during the French Wars of Religion and later during the Franco-Russian War, people looked to her story as an example of courage, patriotism, and a divine mission. Artists, writers, and historians have made her life famous. Her face appeared in stained glass, sculptures, and literature. She was celebrated as both a warrior and a mystic, a simple peasant and a national heroine. In 1920, almost 500 years after she was killed, the Catholic Church officially recognized Joan of Arc as a saint. The girl who had been criticized by church officials was now one of the most respected people in the church. We remember her on May 30th, which is the anniversary of her death. Today, Joan of Arc is still one of the most famous people in the world. Her life was very different from what people expected. She was a peasant, a prophet, a warrior, a prisoner, and a saint. Through her strong beliefs, she changed the course of a kingdom. She became a legend after her death, but she will always be remembered. The life of a medieval baker began in darkness. Long before roosters crowed or church bells told people it was time to get up, bakers were already working hard. Their day often started at around midnight, when most of the town was still asleep. The streets were quiet and cold, but inside the bakehouse, flames crackled, the smell of flowers hung in the air, and the dough was being kneaded. Medieval bread wasn't just made whenever it was thought of. It needed to be done at the right time and with the right technique. Bakers used sourdough starters. These were special doughs that were allowed to ferment. This process made the dough rise and gave it flavor. There were no commercial yeasts. Everything was done by feel, smell, and experience. The flour was often coarse, ground at a local mill, and had its own unique character based on region, season, and grain quality. Some bakers even mixed in bran, barley, or beans to use their flour more efficiently. People used to get water from wells or public fountains. Everything had to be measured and mixed by hand, often in the dim light of oil lamps or candles. The mixing trough was usually wooden, and the dough had to be kneaded until it was the right texture, which took a lot of strength and was a repetitive task. In winter, the dough had to be kept warm with cloths or near the hearth so that it could rise properly. The oven, which was usually a large domed brick structure, had to be heated long before baking. Bakers would burn bundles of wood inside until the walls were hot enough to bake several batches of bread. First, the ashes were raked out carefully. Then, the oven floor was cleaned with a damp cloth or a wooden peel. After that, the loaves were slid in. By the time the town woke up, the bakers had already baked their first loaves. The air smelt of warm bread. It was the scent of food, of everyday survival. In the medieval world, bread was the most important part of every meal. But for the baker, it was just the start. The job involved getting things to customers, keeping records, and serving customers. And once the ovens had cooled down and the counters were clean, there was not much time to rest because tomorrow's dough would need to be mixed before the moon set again. In medieval towns, the baker's work never stopped. To become a skilled medieval baker, you needed more than just flour and a fire. They used a set of tools that had been made by hand for many years. The bakehouse was usually a simple stone or timber frame structure, but inside it was a special place. Everything had a purpose, and being efficient could mean the difference between making a profit and being punished. The oven was the most important part of any bakery. They were usually made of clay or brick and were dome-shaped and very big. It keeps the heat in for hours. It took a long time to heat the oven. People burned bundles of wood, often oak or beech, inside until the walls were the perfect temperature. Then the ashes were spread out and the bread was put in using a peel, which is a long-handled wooden paddle that let bakers put loaves deep into the hot chamber without burning themselves. The kneading trough was another essential item, usually made from a single block of wood or built from thick planks. These troughs were wide and low, which made it easy for bakers to lean into their work. The dough was mixed and worked by hand, and larger bakeries sometimes had several troughs going at once to keep up with demand. The tools they used to measure things were very basic, but they were very important. Most bakers used wooden scoops or special measuring tools for salt and flour, but the amounts were not always the same. Scales were uncommon, and people often had to check the weight of things to make sure they were being weighed fairly. If someone cheated their customers by giving them less bread than they paid for, they could be fined or even punished worse. Flour was stored in cloth sacks or wooden barrels, while water was hauled in buckets from wells or streams. Some bakeries also had special tools for removing husks or other unwanted bits from bread, especially in wealthier towns where people expected finer bread. But for the lower classes, flours that were less delicate were more common. The baker's hands were very useful. They were rough, strong, and had been used a lot. They knew when the dough was ready, when the oven was hot enough, and when a loaf was just beginning to bake. Everything had to be cleaned and prepared before the next day. The tools, simple though they were part of a bigger pattern of work, skill, and heat that changed raw grain into bread that kept people alive. In the past, bakers used their tools to make bread for their whole town. In medieval times, bread was more than just food. It was the most important part of every meal and a sign of social class. Almost everyone ate bread every day, but not all bread was the same. What you ate says a lot about who you are. The richest people, nobles, religious leaders, and successful merchants wanted the best bread, called manchet or white bread, made from very fine wheat flour. This bread was soft, pale, and expensive. Making it required extra work like grinding and sifting out the bran, and only using the best parts of the grain. This took a lot of work, which made it expensive. This meant that most people couldn't afford it. People living in towns and working as tradesmen ate rye or wheat bread as a normal part of their diet. It was made from wheat and was less refined, slightly darker, and more nutritious. It was cheap enough for the baker to sell a lot of it, and it was good quality. In some towns, the law said that bread had to be sold at a fixed weight and price to stop bakers taking advantage of people who were hungry. But for the poor, the laborers, peasants, and beggars, there was maslin or black bread, which was often made from a mix of rye, barley, oats, and whatever else was available. This bread was dense, coarse, and sometimes bitter. In hard times, bakers might even use beans, peas, or chestnut flour instead. It was filling, yes, but it also reminds you of your place in society. In monasteries, the bread available changed depending on the type of monastery. Some monks ate simple loaves of bread to show they were poor. Other monks, who were richer, made high-quality white bread for guests and important members of the church. Bread was also used as a way for people to connect with each other. At feasts, rich people would use trenches and thick slices of stale bread as plates. After the meal, the servants would eat some of the food, and the rest would be given to the poor. People often gave charity in the form of bread, which was handed out at monastery gates or from noble kitchens. A skilled baker needs to understand these divisions. They didn't just bake one type of loaf. They produced many different types every day to meet the needs of the whole town. Bread was more than just a way to get food into your body. It was all about the economy, hierarchy, and identity. In a world where most people had little, bread showed who had more and who had less. Being a baker in medieval Europe was not just about having the right skills. It was also a legal issue. Bread was considered so important to life that its production was strictly controlled by local authorities and trade guilds. For a baker, breaking the rules wasn't just bad for business. It could mean being embarrassed in public, losing your job, or even going to prison. In most towns and cities, guilds were in charge of the different types of jobs. These were groups of craftsmen who made sure the quality was good, that training was provided, that prices were fair, and that supplies were enough. In the past, groups of bakers, known as guilds, had very strict rules about how bread should be made. They decided how much the bread should weigh, how big it should be, and what ingredients should be used. These standards weren't optional. They were put into action through regular checks and severe punishments. New bakers often had to learn their skills from a more experienced baker for several years before they were allowed to use their own ovens. Being in a guild was a big deal. It was a privilege to be in one, and it also made people safer. It gave bakers the right to sell their bread in the town market and made sure they had enough money to live on. But it also meant they had to follow certain rules. If a baker was caught selling loaves that were too light or using poor quality ingredients, the guild officials could take action. They could stop the baker from working or even take away their right to bake altogether. As well as the guilds, the local government also checked the quality of bread. In England, for instance, a law from the 13th century said exactly how much bread a customer should get for a set price, which changed with the cost of grain. People in charge, called bread weirs or ale tasters, checked on a surprise basis and reported anyone who did not follow the rules. Breaking the rules about bread could have serious consequences. Some bakers were made fun of and locked up where they were pelted with stale bread and rotten food. Others were made to walk through the town with bad bread tied around their necks. In the worst cases, someone who keeps committing the same crime could be banned from the trade or sent away from the town. These rules weren't just about being fair. They were about survival. In times of famine or inflation, people would often riot over bread. The leaders of the town knew that if people thought they were not getting enough bread, there might be trouble. For medieval bakers, being precise was not just important, it was essential. It was the law. Every loaf had to be the right size. The guild and the town saw baking as more than just a job. It was a public service. Running a medieval bakehouse wasn't easy. It was dangerous. Fire was both necessary and always a risk. Ovens had to reach very high temperatures to bake dense loaves, and keeping that heat meant burning large amounts of wood. This was often done in enclosed spaces made of timber, thatch, or stone that had been blackened by years of smoke. Most bakehouses were built with a large oven made of clay or brick, which was placed against an outer wall so that air could flow in and out and food could be put in. To heat it, bakers lit a roaring fire inside the oven itself. This wasn't a casual campfire. This was a very hot fire meant to make thick walls very hot for hours. When a fire had burned for long enough, bakers would remove the embers, clean the hearth with a wet cloth or a brush soaked in sand, and then start baking. But even a small mistake could lead to a big problem. Fire could spread. Thatched roofs could catch fire, and in busy towns and cities, a bakery fire could spread quickly. For this reason, many towns decided that bakeries should be located on the outskirts of the town, or they should be built using special fire-resistant materials, if the baker could afford them. Bakers also faced health risks. Being around a lot of heat and smoke for a long time was bad for the lungs and skin. The hard work of carrying heavy flour sacks and kneading large amounts of dough made the body tired over time. Burns were common on arms, hands, and faces. These are caused by handling hot loaves with long wooden peelings. Some cities had communal bakehouses, especially in poorer neighborhoods. Families would make the dough at home and take it to a central oven that was managed by a professional baker. This system saved fuel and reduced fire hazards in people's homes, but it also created new risks. People could burn, steal, or tamper with the loaves. Bakers were responsible for making sure that each household's bread was good. If they didn't do their job properly, people could make official complaints. Because bread was such an important food, if there was a problem in the bakery, like a fire, or someone got sick, or something went wrong, it could affect the whole town. It wasn't just the baker who suffered. The whole community was sad. But even with these dangers, the bakery was still the most important place in their lives. It was a place of hard work. Heat and routine where the risk and reward of making the bread was obvious with every loaf that was baked. The image of the medieval baker usually shows men in the guild and their apprentices. But women were very important in making bread every day. In many towns and villages, especially outside of big cities, women were the main bakers for their families and communities. They were very important in keeping the ovens hot and making sure everyone had enough to eat. In the countryside, it was usually women who did the baking at home. They baked for their families using shared ovens or small hearths. And when they have more than they need, they might sell loaves at the market or from their door. For many women, selling bread was a way to make money for themselves. In cities, widows of bakers were often allowed to continue their husbands' businesses. Sometimes, they even became successful bakery owners themselves. Guilds were mostly made up of men, but women were welcome too. In some places, like parts of Germany and France, female bakers were officially recognized. Women could get licenses, run bakeries, and train apprentices, including daughters or nieces. Some of them even asked for full guild rights and managed to get them, but this meant dealing with legal and social problems. Women in bakeries did the same difficult work as men. This included mixing dough in big troughs, carrying water and flour, and managing the oven temperatures. They also sold bread in markets. Many of them also worked as bread sellers. walking through the streets with baskets balanced on their heads or carts loaded with loaves. These women were often the face of the bakery, dealing directly with customers and managing daily sales. But even though they worked just as hard, women often got paid less and didn't get the same recognition as men. They were more likely to be accused of selling bread that was underweight or of poor quality, and if they broke the rules, they would be punished severely. But women were very important, especially during wars or epidemics when men were away and communities needed them to grow food. Baking also connected with being a mother and looking after others. A woman who was good at baking was seen as someone who was capable and respectable. She was able to keep her household fed, preserve traditions, and pass down knowledge. In many families, recipes and baking techniques were passed down from mother to daughter, like heirlooms. Women were key to bread production in medieval society, from noble kitchens to village ovens. Although history often left them unnamed, their hands were among the first to touch the dough that would nourish entire towns. In medieval Europe, bread was more than just food. It was seen as sacred. The church had a big influence on bread making. It ate a lot of bread and also decided how bread should be made, sold, and given out. In monasteries, cathedrals, and village chapels, bread was a symbol of life, sacrifice, and the presence of God. The most important part of this connection was the Eucharist, where bread became the body of Christ. The preparation of this bread, often called the host, was subject to strict guidelines. Only the best white wheat flour could be used, and it had to be unleavened. In monasteries, some monks were given the job of baking in silence, often at night, in special ovens. These wafers were stamped with sacred symbols and handled with extreme respect. But the church's relationship with bread was more than just a ritual. In medieval Europe, monasteries owned a lot of land and produced a lot of food. Many of them had their own bakeries, where they produced lots of bread for the monks, their workers, and guests. Monks would typically have several servings of bread each day, along with cheese, ale, or a thick soup. Monasteries also helped the poor by giving out weapons and food to beggars and travelers. Cathedrals and local churches often received donations of bread from local bakers and wealthy patrons. These offerings might be displayed on feast days, given to people in need, or used in ceremonial processions. Some towns even had special bread altars where loaves were blessed and handed out to remember the dead. The church also had a regulatory role. In some towns, religious courts dealt with disagreements between bakers and customers, especially in areas where the local church was in charge of business. They made sure that prices and weights were fair. They were often motivated by the belief that cheating customers out of bread was not just dishonest, but sinful. On religious feast days, special breads were baked. These rich, spiced loaves were shaped into crosses, doves, or other sacred shapes. These celebratory breads marked the rhythm of the church year and were often shared with the community to strengthen bonds of faith and friendship. In medieval times, bread was more than just something to eat. It was like a spiritual nourishment. For the baker, supplying bread to the church was more than just a way to make money. It meant taking part in the sacred life cycle where bread was a symbol of life and the oven was used for both special and everyday occasions. In medieval times, bread was closely linked to power. For rulers, mayors, guild masters, and kings, controlling the price, supply, and quality of bread was as important as maintaining order. Most people ate bread for most of their meals, and sometimes bread was 70% of what they ate. It was only available when the country was politically stable. The most obvious way this happened was through price controls. In the past, cities and kingdoms set official prices for bread. They did this by making laws about how big bread and ale should be. In England, for example, they decided how much a loaf of bread would cost based on the current price of grain. If grain prices went up because of poor harvests, drought, or war, bakers were expected to make their loaves bigger, not to raise the price. This meant that when there was not much bread available, bakers had to make smaller loaves for the same price. This often meant that they were making less profit. But if a baker was caught cheating customers or selling loaves that weighed less than the legal minimum, they could be punished severely. The authorities saw cheating not just as theft, but as something that broke the public's trust. In some towns, bakers were made to stand in public stocks while holding loaves that were too light. Others were fined, shamed, or even banned from baking. Bakers had to keep detailed records of the grain they bought, how much flour they used, and how many loaves of bread they baked. Inspectors could show up without warning to weigh loaves of bread and check the ovens. In times of war or famine, bakers were sometimes watched by the army to make sure that everyone got their bread. Bread riots were some of the most feared expressions of unrest. When bread was rare or too expensive, crowds would quickly gather. In the past, people sometimes accused bakers of hoarding flour or only making bread for rich people. Entire shops could be looted and records destroyed. To keep people calm, city officials sometimes took grain or gave people bread to stop them from protesting. Because bread is so important to life, it became a way for people to show charity and control. Rulers gave out bread during public celebrations or religious festivals to win the people's favor. In castles, lords made sure their servants and workers had enough food and other supplies, so they would be loyal to them. And in towns, it was seen as a sign that the government was doing a good job if there was always enough cheap bread. In medieval times, bread was more than just food. It was a symbol of power. The baker was in a difficult position because he was hungry and had to follow orders from his bosses. The medieval baker is not often mentioned in history books or praised in songs, but he had a big impact on everyday life. In a world full of castles and churches, and with kings and knights around, it was the simple baker who fed everyone. And while they were working in the dark before the town woke up, their work had a big effect on every household. The baker's influence spread beyond the ovens and into the very fabric of medieval society. Bread was a part of every stage of life, from birth to death. It was used in baptisms, shared at weddings, given to people who were sad, and put on church altars. Every loaf baked carried with it centuries of tradition, belief, and survival. The skills of the baker were passed down through generations, often within families or through apprenticeships. People were taught techniques by doing them over and over again. This is how you know when the dough is ready. A guide to reading the oven's heat without using a thermometer. Here's how to stretch your flour when you're on a budget without sacrificing quality. These traditions were very important to the people who lived there. A baker in one area might use rye and oats, while another might use barley or wheat from another country. Every town had its own character. As cities grew and trade expanded, the role of the baker changed over time. By the late Middle Ages, there were more and more bakeries, and baking went from being a small household craft to a big industry. New inventions like windmills and water mills made it easier to make flour, and better roads helped grain get from farms to markets more quickly. But the way they bake has stayed the same. Rise, knead, shape, fire, feed. It was a cycle as old as civilization, and the medieval baker was its quiet guardian. Even today, we can still see the results of their work. The word for companion comes from the Latin campanis, which means bread. This shows that in the past, sharing bread was a sign of sharing life. The guilds that used to make sure bakers were doing things properly were the first to set up modern food safety standards, and the shared ovens in medieval villages were the first of today's local bakeries. The medieval baker's legacy is twofold: the loaves they made and the communities they sustained. Through flowers, fire, and faith, they fed more than just bodies. They fed whole communities.